we have this false belief that if we get the most out of each day, we will get the most out of the year. But it is false, because to get the most out of the year, at some point, you need to take a few actions which bring no direct outcome today, but are necessary to get to the next level over the course of the year.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast of stories from experienced practitioners seeking wisdom in business, entrepreneurship, investing, and the arts. We are your hosts, John, Paul, Will, and Ferdinand. Today we are joined once again by management advisor and author Luca Dellanna. Since we last spoke with Luca, he has published 3 more books, including the book we'll speak about today, Winning Long-Term Games. Fascinating concepts in the book: maximum reproducible returns, optimizing decisions across multiple timescales. Really good stuff. One of my friends who's currently reading the book has remarked that he is reading the book slowly because it's so good he doesn't want it to end. So we're excited to speak with Luca about that today.
Luca, welcome. This is actually the second time around, because not only have we had many conversations offline around lots of the interesting areas that we covered in our first conversation, but also I think there's a depth that I think all of the conversation that we had collectively as a group outside after the podcast, and then also with other people, I think it would just be really interesting to delve a little bit deeper today into some of the specific ideas. Just to give the context to any listener who hasn't actually come across our first episode with Luca was actually primarily around quality and management. And so it was very much focused on the manager themselves as an individual within a big system. And we tried to explore what quality looks like within that. Today, it will be a little bit different in terms of how we go about it. And it'll be a little bit more within the context of the ideas and the application of those ideas to the businesses. And in particular, some of the bigger ideas that Luca has been working on. So, Luca, welcome. I think I can speak on behalf of all of us to say we love being able to talk through these things with you. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me back.
One of the big things I just want in terms of housekeeping in particular, I want everybody to just be aware of some of your background. So I know in the previous episode we can go through, but at a high level for everybody, Luca, I think at this point you have 30,000 readers in terms of your emails that go out. You now have 12 books. I was looking at our notes. I think you had 9 when we were talking first of all, and now we're at 12. So you're working very hard on that front. And that covers everything from ergodicity to anti-fragility to operations, and even a book on COVID and some of the nuances around COVID as well. So we definitely recommend for anyone to go and check that out on your website. We'll also have a link in the bio. And then I think the other interesting things that we've seen, Luca, is some of the areas that you've been applying these ideas that sit outside of kind of more in the investor space almost. I wonder, could you just touch on that and just kind of give some context in terms of how unusual networks are picking up on your ideas, and maybe some of the interesting examples from the past couple of weeks or months that just might be interesting to share with folks?
Yeah, so most of the interest amongst investors started with the book on ergodicity, which is an idea that most investors, they kind of like understand on an intuitive basis, but there was a lack of examples and the vocabulary to talk about it. And my book provided that, and it really helped people like to talk with each other about what's the influence of reversibility on investments, how they should change to justify some choices that maybe they were already taking, but they didn't know how to justify to others. And so that started interesting investors a lot. And then now my latest book, it's called Winning Long-Term Games, which does the same thing with long-term thinking. There are a lot of investors which know the importance of thinking long-term, but maybe they don't really know how to explain to others why exactly it's so important, especially when you see other investors which maybe have a shorter term strategy and they look like they're getting ahead and you need to justify to others why the fact that they're ahead now doesn't mean that their strategy is better and that we should switch from our strategy to theirs. It's things that were intuitively understood, but people lack the examples and the justifications and the reasonings. And that's what my book provided, and that's why it became popular over these groups.
Yeah. It also strikes me that a lot of the conversations, even in Omaha, where we were recently, a lot of the conversations where it's striking are people just saying, there's a lot of kind of short-term thinking is effectively the default in 90% of all the systems that people are playing in. And so investors seem to be coming at it saying, well, are there any long-term businesses that also, I'm a long-term investor, therefore can I kind of match those two things? What was really interesting in our conversations, it's actually almost a question of how, if you have a long-term orientation as an investor, should you be able to expect that of a business, or actually is that just you having a map up in your ivory tower and then just looking at the reality of business and hoping that there's a perfect formula, but actually in reality it's chaos, and in reality short-term decisions have to be made, and then in a theoretical sense it may feel long-term, but actually the reality is very much a short-term and kind of adaptation or an adaptive system generally. Have you had many businesses reach out to you saying, we know this feels important to us and we've come at it through that investor ecosystem, and have they been starting to integrate that into their day-to-day operations in terms of long-term thinking?
So first of all, we need to think about it not in terms of binary. Long-term thinking doesn't mean that you don't take short-term decisions, because of course, you're taking, in the course of business, you're taking a lot of immediate decisions, you have emergencies and whatnot. Long-term thinking means two things. One, it means that in addition to all the short-term things that you need to do in your business, you set aside a small but significant part of your time to do things which look unnecessary now, but will be completely necessary to grow beyond a certain point in the future. Things such as training your people, for example. And again, training your people doesn't mean that you need to spend a big part of your week on it, but it means that every now and then you need to think about it, because if you don't, you will notice that you plateau, that you cannot grow beyond a certain point. So this is one thing. And then the other thing is that long-term thinking means that when you take short-term decisions, you never take them in a way that compromise the long-term. So you always try to take them in a way that you don't create excessive managerial debt, technical debt, risk, and all other things which again prevent you from growing beyond a certain point in the future. So this is what it means for me, long-term thinking.
Luca, could you share a story that illustrates?
Yeah. So, all my books, those books, they always start from stories and anecdotes and discussions that I have with my clients. And a very recurring discussion which I have with my clients is about training. Because a lot of managers know about the importance of training, but then in the day-to-day, it always feels like they have something more urgent. And so I have plenty of managers who tell me look, I know I should train my people, but every week I spend all my available time. I have things that I need to finish by this week and I cannot go. And the thing is, we have this false belief, and most of us do, if not all of us did at least at a certain point, that if we get the most out of each day, we will get the most out of the year. But it is false, because to get the most out of the year, at some point, you need to take a few actions which bring no direct outcome today, but are necessary to get to the next level over the course of the year. And one of those actions is training. And this means that training is not something that you do when you get the time, especially if you notice that in your track record, you didn't manage to find the time over the past 6 months. At some point, you need to do it anyway, because basically that's what will give you the time. If you are overworked, usually there is a skills issue at some point. And training is how you will get out of it. And this applies to to a lot of things. And so I have stories of managers that I had to really make them see how if they don't train, they will keep having this bad life, which is always running. And more importantly, the tipping point is when I make them understand that their career potential is ultimately capped by the potential of their team. And if they never grow the potential of their team, no matter how well they do everything else, they will always be capped to a certain point. Well, the cynic could say they can always jump companies, and there is some truth to that. But other than that, yeah.
What about, you are an author, you're a consultant, an advisor, you're a trainer, you're many things. What are some ways that you've embedded this idea of playing long-term games as you've grown as an author, as an advisor, as you built your businesses, so to speak?
Yeah, so I make an example with my mailing list and with my social media. There are people who play it the short-term way, the email list. And that means that they write emails that consume the trust of their audience in order to get more sales or more signups. Maybe they overpromise, maybe they exaggerate, maybe they say something which is not fully true, maybe they suggest a method which they know will work in the short term but not in the long term. Maybe they will counter the story that they know is reproducible and so on. And these things, they work better in the short term, but they only work up to a certain point. Because maybe the person is more likely to sign up to their email list, but then they drop out after 1 month. My approach instead is that I write emails to build the trust of my audience. My objective is that every email I send out, I make you more likely to open the next one. I make you more likely to eventually trust me enough so that you will want to enter in business with me. And so this is an example. Another example is that in my books, I very seldomly talk about fashions, about trends, about the very last, management trend, or stories, which are very subjective to be irreproducible or that are likely to regress to the mean. Why? Because what I want to do, I don't want to be the person that you read the book and you call me now. I want to be the person that you read the book and in 5 or 10 years, you realize that everything I've written is still valid, whereas many other people, what they've written got disproved. And I know that there is a lot of value in that because at the beginning of my career, I used to work for a consulting company which had a good reputation of not being called as the first consulting company, but as the second or the third one, because during the consulting calls, during the sales calls, we were telling them what they needed to do, for example, for this to succeed and so on. And maybe others were making easier promises, so we were very seldom the first person that they will call. But we would very frequently the company that they will call once the first company failed. And so, because of being able to experience that this long-term thinking actually works eventually, now I have the conviction necessary to do it on my own.
I love that. One of the things I've enjoyed about your writing is I very often encounter ways of phrasing a concept that maybe I sort of had intuited but didn't have the words for. And one of my favorites from your new book is this idea of maximum reproducible return. So could you introduce that idea and then maybe give some examples to illustrate it?
Yeah. So imagine you are a Formula One racer. And imagine that you're racing on a circuit and you're racing at 1 minute 20 per lap. You've been doing it quite a lot and you're confident that it's a good speed. And then you see other racers going at 1 minute 19. And then you accelerate and you learn and you discover that yes, you can also keep this. And then you see maybe other racers taking more risks and going at 1 minute 18. And you notice that level of risk is not something you can keep reproducibly. Maybe it means that every time you lap at 1 minute 18, you have a 1% chance of incident. So that's not reproducible anymore. And now you have a choice to make, which is, do you go beyond the maximum reproducible speed? Now, in Formula One, since there can be only one winner in the race, and since the number of races is limited, of laps is limited, let's say 60, there is an argument in saying there is a level of failure I can accept, let's say a cumulative 10%, because I need to get first. And because if I get 10th, I get nothing. In investing, there is the same concept of maximum reproducible returns, which is the amount of returns you can grab without taking risks of irreversible excessive risk, which might be going bankrupt, or might even be just the risk that you get such a big loss that it undoes all the good returns you got in the last 10 years. The difference with investing is that you don't really care whether you arrive first or whether you arrive 10th. As long as you get very wealthy out of it, you're a winner. And so this concept becomes more important in these open-ended games, such as investing or life, in which you really want to reach your maximum reproducible return and then not go beyond that. Even when there are other people that are going faster than that, because you know that they are taking risks and eventually they will drop off. We see this in investing. Every year, there are people who are posting incredible returns, but every year it's always a different person. And you don't want that. You are one person, so you want to only hit the maximum reproducible return. And then it's not an invitation to be lazy or excessively risky conservative, because if your maximum reproducible speed is 1 minute 19, I want you to go at 1 minute 19, not 1 minute 20 and not 1 minute 22. So it's not about being lazy or being overly conservative. It's about understanding what's the sweet spot over which you start to taking risks that you will regret.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, Luca, that it definitely reminds me of the concept that Buffett always talks about, where have your swing spot for the baseball player and basically aim to have as consistent a highest number as possible, but effectively you always need to make sure that you're within the sweet spot to be able to get any form of a home run. And so in an investor sense, we've seen a huge amount of this in the past, let's say 4 years through COVID. There was a lot of movement where suddenly people became the biggest geniuses in the world, and now they've fallen away. And so when you actually look over a 15-year period, it washed out. And so in the game of investing, it played out, right? That there was a maximum reproducible return that was achieved by certain players that were in the game 15 years ago, and they are still achieving it. Versus there were a lot of people who entered maybe in, let's say, 2015, 16, who now have suffered exactly what you've just described. And I guess the idea of the maximum reproducible concept, why is it so difficult for us to do something about it, right? Because a lot of this, it seems like conceptually we can understand this, but for some reason the behavior is the thing that's continuing, right? And where are we not understanding it, or where's the average person really struggling with this dynamic?
Yeah, let's go back to the Formula One example. Imagine you're racing at 119. And you think that it's the most you can do reproducibly. And then you see another racer going at 118. So you think, isn't this evidence that I can race at 118 as well? And we need to be very careful that that's evidence that you can do it, but it's never evidence that you can do it reproducibly. So how do you know whether something is reproducible? In the case of the Formula One driver, you need to look at the small near misses. If while you're driving at 119, the moment you try to go faster, maybe you start to take a turn slightly worse, maybe you have a little bit of an emergency braking, all those small things are indications that you are going beyond your capacity. And we need to be careful about interpreting it correctly, because some drivers would interpret the fact that they had an emergency braking and they didn't crash, they might interpret it as a sign that they have good reflexes. It's not, because reflexes are not so reproducible. You need always to interpret it as a sign that you're going beyond what's reproducible. Then you might want to say, like, maybe it's a skill issue, maybe I need to learn some more skills, maybe, but it's not like a courage issue. It's not a risk issue. And so that's the framing. And the same applies to investments. If we know that this is the amount of level at which we can maximally comfortably operate, and we see someone going faster, like taking more risk than that, we need to understand that the fact that they did it this year doesn't mean that they can do it reproducibly, and doesn't mean that we can do it reproducibly. That's the mental switch that we need to take.
And what's the the language to even start to understand what I can do reproducibly, right? Like the concept, I guess what I'm trying to grapple with the concept is like, is there a role of time required and experience required before you can even tell? Like, how do you even build a feedback loop to understand that? Because in a racing context, those guys have engineers, they have the data coming out of the engineers, and they have third-party folks who are effectively mapping all this out and then trying to make sense of it. Same with sports teams, with managers and their data analytics teams. But how does that map back to the kind of individual or to a business?
Two of the tools I suggest in the book, one is so first of all, there is no exact science on this because we're talking about probabilities in an ever-changing world. But one of the things I suggest is to look at how others with the same goal of yours failed, especially others with the same strategy that you're entertaining. Once you know why people failed and you took actions to be able to say this will not apply to me because I mitigated the risk, then you can start to consider maybe I can take that risk. And this is especially interesting because if we're talking about investors and you start asking yourself, why did investors fail? Well, there will be a part of investors which failed because they really didn't know the basics, they were just gambling and whatnot. Okay, but then why did smart? Because maybe you think, I am not dumb, I am smart. Okay, the next question is, why are other smart investors failing? And that's where things start to get interesting. And maybe you discover that it's because they don't have a partner to exchange ideas with and to prevent them from taking impulsive decision or ego-based decision. Maybe that's one thing. Another thing could be because they're consistently betting too much. Then you start discovering some interesting things because in some cases, the reason has little to do with investing and it starts with an unstable marriage, for example, or with the fact that they are all friends with people with an excessive risk tolerance. And so you discover a lot. So this is the first tool. Think about how people with the same goal as yours failed, especially if they are as smart as you. And then the second tool is imagine that despite your strategy, which you imagine to be very good, you execute perfectly on it, and yet you fail. And you ask yourself, why? What could be the most likely reason? And what can I do about it? And that's another very powerful exercise. And the fewer blind spots you have, then you can start optimizing. But you should never start optimizing before you took care of your blind spots.
And if we continue with the sporting analogy, assuming so you haven't used the word training, or like basically the concept of like you hear about these famous basketball players, football players, all sorts of sports legends who effectively were the most dedicated to their training and their craft generally outside of the court or outside of the pitch. How does that feed into the concept? Because there's an element in investing that it's a practice-based concept that is learned over time. So yeah, how does that feed in?
Yeah, I think we need to differentiate between training the tactic and training the strategy. Because one point that I'm making in the book is that it's okay to have a tactic that doesn't work all the time or that it's not reproducible. For example, when you invest in startups, of course you know that it's not going to work all the time. When you start a startup, of course but what's important is that the strategy is reproducible. So the way you're linking your irreproducible tactics must be reproducible itself. It means that over the course of your career, it must lead you to inevitable success. And so that shows us that there are some tactics which it's okay if they fail, but they need to fail in a way that they don't prevent you from doing it again. And they need to have a success rate which is high enough that if you take 20 of them, at least one succeed. So back to the sports analogy. Let's imagine you're training, you're a professional athlete. You need to do two things. You need to train the tactic. So that means train the skill which is relevant to their sport. I don't know, driving, training their muscles, and so on. And then you need to train the strategy, which is making sure that the way they train, the way they drive, the way they play is sustainable over their career, or at least over a span which is long enough over their career so that they can eventually reap the fruits of their labor. Yeah, and the second type of training is very much forgotten, but I think that's quite important.
What you've described is almost an element of what every sports club tries to do, but fails at in many ways, because certainly the sports that are big in Ireland, most of them are now churning out larger. So rugby, for an example, are churning out bigger players. They're having shorter careers, and they're effectively, there's a higher replacement number of players coming through the system to replace the damage that's happening throughout the system. And so in a way, what you're describing, they think they're walking the walk when it comes to the concept, but actually the long-term outcome is unknown, because it might be concussion type dynamics that you saw in football or American football in the States, but it may take 20, 30 years for that to actually come through, and you're seeing signs of it. In an investment context, that dynamic that you're speaking to also exists at like a passive investor kind of level, or somebody who's investing in an ETF, for example, where it's effectively just a container. There's a certain amount of businesses that filter out every year, and then there's a certain amount of businesses that get fed in. But in general, you're betting on one form, which is, I just want the system to perpetually exist, frankly, for 10 years. And then you compare that to the other type of investor that we would know, which is more, they call them active investors. And they effectively are choosing one or a selection of the businesses that now are individual players, to use that term, who may actually have a different survival rate because they have to win. Either within their business, they need to kind of almost rejuvenate themselves every 5 years with new products, whether that's Apple going from one laptop to 10 laptops or to the 10th product, or whatever it needs to be. They need to basically rejuvenate themselves over time, or they will kind of fade away. Have you seen this concept kind of mapped into the investor container like that? And when it comes to that distinction of like active versus passive at all?
Yeah, so a couple of things on this. So one is, when you're a passive investor, so good thing is that probably you have much less catastrophic risk, especially if you have a relatively well-balanced portfolio and whatnot. But there is some difference between short-term thinking and long-term thinking, because, for example, if your time horizon is 3 years, you almost don't really care about fees that much. If your time horizon is 30 years, you definitely care about fees, because there is this compounding. So that's one thing. One mistake that people do is when they say that they have a 10 years or 7 years investment. And I'm like, unless you have a very good reason for that thing, I don't know, you are terminally ill, or in 7 years, your son will move out and you want to buy him a house. So unless you have a very good reason, your time horizon is not 7 years or 10 years. Usually it's 20 years, 50 years. Whatever your life expectancy you imagine it to be. And it seems trivial, but it's different. If that's your time horizon, that's the time horizon you should be thinking about. So this is one thing. And then going back to the very good point you mentioned, that when you are a fund manager, maybe in a larger organization, you have the pressure that you need to perform at some level, because otherwise you don't reach the targets, the clients move to competitors, and then you get fired eventually, something like this. And this is true. And this means that you cannot fully apply long-term thinking to the same amount that you would apply it otherwise. But you can still kind of Pareto optimize it, like you can think, what would it mean to go to 100% of what Luca describes in the book? And I am now at 0. What would look like if I went to 20? If I took the 20% of the most significant things I can do, that decrease the risk much more than they decrease performance. And I think that's the sweet spot. And then whether that sweet spot is at 20, 40, 60, depends on your incentives, on your clients, and on your manager. But there is always a sweet spot towards which you can make some move towards.
Can we riff on that a little bit? So what I'm wondering is when you do a look back on investors that have lasted for years, so take Ben Graham, with his Geico investment, he outperformed most of his peers. Without his Geico investment, he didn't. And obviously he's known for much more than just his partnership. If you look at Berkshire Hathaway, if Buffett hadn't made the Apple investment in 2015 and 16, and its last 10 years performance with or without that. And there's lots of examples where, and you see this in building businesses too, where there were make or break items. What is Apple without the iPhone, et cetera, right? And so obviously these are systems where there are lots of inputs, lots of decisions, et cetera. But at least from the future looking back, you can realize there are really a handful of things that carried most of the weight of that success. And so I'm mentally trying to marry that with maximum reproducible return. It was never guaranteed that Apple would create the iPhone. And if we ran Apple over 1,000 times, I don't know in how many of those, iterations they create the iPhone. So how do you sort of marry those two things?
Yeah, so there are two components to answering these. One has to do with survivorship bias. And in the book, I make an example of Alice and Bob, where Alice is an entrepreneur that takes more risks. So she has a higher growth, but also a bit more risks. And Bob is more conservative. And what I'm showing in that example is that if you simulate, 10 years with 100 people using Alice's strategy and 100 Bobs, what you notice is that the winner will surely be Alice. However, on aggregate, the average Bob has more wealth. And so the question is always like, when you look at winners in the news between investors, you will always see some level of survivorship bias because they got some make or break, because they got something. But when you are thinking about what's the best strategy for you, who are only one person, you want to choose the strategy as the net of survivorship bias. So going back to the question, the thing like, surely we can imagine that given a few parallel universes, Berkshire's or Ben Graham's returns will be quite varied because they each had like one of these make or break things. What you want to check is what's the distribution of their outcomes and what's the percentage of parallel worlds in which they are satisfactory. That's the mental switch from asking yourself, what's the maximum average growth you can get, maximizing your average growth, or maximizing the percentage of possible futures in which you're happy with your investments. And my personal opinion is that you should always try to go to 100 or 99% of possible futures in which you're happy in your investments, and then only maximize average returns to the extent that what you're doing doesn't bring the other number below 99%.
So this is a form of process over outcome in a bit of a way. Is that fair?
No, I don't think so. Like I'm very, very much focusing on outcomes. The difference is which kind of outcomes I'm focusing on, and the fact that I'm focusing, first of all, the metric is the percentage of possible futures in which I'm happy. That's the first metric over which everything else is subordinate. That's an outcome. That's very much an outcome. And I'm being very ambitious because I'm actively trying to maximize this. So it's very much outcome oriented in my opinion. And going back to the Berkshire example with Apple or Graham with Geico. So one takeaway for me is you should be able to make some bets which disproportionate returns to some extent. The other takeaway is that you should always only do them in a way which fits within a reproducible strategy. So the idea is always like you try to optimize, but you only optimize what makes sense over a long-term reproducible, in the context of a long-term reproducible strategy.
If I just think about my example or my scenario where, let's say, I've learned from other people how they failed, what they've done, what you end up doing through that process is almost kind of put redundancy into your plan to say, okay, I have an investment approach. You might actually spot where they failed, you shore that up and you say, okay, well, I'm more likely to actually survive long term. It strikes me that Berkshire came to mind as you were discussing the idea of this, where we're talking about maximizing the effectively the percentage of future realities or future outcomes that you A, survive, but B, actually achieve the average return. Have you seen that mapped to Berkshire or any of these larger companies that tend to almost just shore up backup plans to the point that they almost survive in all outcomes? Or is it kind of still in the incubation stage in terms of the idea being brought to businesses of that scale?
Yeah, redundancy is a necessary component to some degree. Like you have Berkshire, which has a fair amount, large amount of cash compared to the returns that they bring. You have a lot of large companies which are redundant to the amount of workers that they have, of relationships that they build, risks that they manage, and so on. Now, I don't want to give the impression that you should maximize redundancy, because very obviously there is a point over which redundancy becomes a waste. So imagine that you have a bar which measures the percentages of possible futures in which you're happy. And maybe your current strategy is 80. And then you add some redundancy and you get to 90. Perfect. You add some more redundancy, you get to 99. Fantastic. You add some more redundancy and you get to 100. Good. You add a bit more redundancy, you're still at 100. That last bit of redundancy you added is waste. So this is one way in which you can think about it. Another way in which you can think about it is that very often when I talk about risks, people are telling me, Luca, you're saying that you shouldn't take risks at all. So you're saying that I shouldn't go out of my house, that I shouldn't cross the street. And I'm saying no, because whether you cross the street or don't cross the street, you will almost have the same percentage of parallel worlds in which you survive. Like crossing the street maybe decreases you, 1 in a million. That's negligible. So definitely that's a risk you can take. Maybe I don't know, doing cave diving, maybe instead it's a bit different. I don't know the numbers, but what you want to check is always the percentage of parallel futures in which you're happy, and you want to hit that sweet spot about 99 to 100, not 101, that's waste, and not 90, that's too risky.
And Luca, have you seen it applied to kind of training generally? So it strikes me what you're talking about also seems to be the idea that people are talking about it when they talk to longevity. So longevity planning, don't train to the detriment of that future self, be it your 100-year-old self. And Peter Attias, then he's definitely moving everybody's mindset, I think, that direction. But have you seen it being applied in that context, or is that over extrapolation?
No, yeah, totally. That's definitely a context that comes to mind. Like, while there is the general principle that training makes you healthy, and if you're a professional athlete makes you good, there is also the concept that there is an amount over which you overtrain. And so, again, what's the sweet spot? Again, it goes to hitting this 99% of parallel futures in which you're happy. That's what tells when an athlete is overtraining. Then you can make the argument that maybe a professional athlete who's extremely competitive wants to go to 90% because that's what's necessary to win a championship. That's fine, but still, what he's optimizing is the amount of parallel worlds in which he wins a championship. He's not optimizing how strong he is. So it always goes into optimizing the number of parallel worlds in which you achieve the outcome you're trying to achieve.
That strikes me as both wise and often very difficult to estimate. So do you have any stories of maybe ways that companies or people have estimated playing something over 1,000 times and having a sense of, okay, in 900 of these things go well and in 100 they don't? I mean, any just like almost case studies where we could see examples of how people have figured out how to do this?
Yeah, so I think that it's relatively harder to play it with real experience just because the world is so complex and ever changing, and you cannot really keep all the variables fixed. And if you think that you can, you're fooling yourself. What I've seen companies do well instead is that they're paranoid about thinking how things can go wrong. So they ask themselves, what can go wrong? What are the chances of it? And is it a risk that if we take together with all the other risks we're taking, and we take it long enough, repeatedly over our time horizon of concern, it cumulates to something significant enough to bring us out of business. And there are some companies that think about it. I don't really know about a company that always thinks about it in all sectors, but I do know about companies which think about it in this way, at least for a part of maybe about the supply chain, maybe about some key projects, and so on.
Yeah, you mentioned Berkshire's cash pile, or one of the side quests we've gone on is looking at companies that have lasted hundreds of years and many generations of owners, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, that there are attributes of firms that you could sort of boil down to being paranoid about how the future could go wrong, and so they have more spare resource than they need, and they have and so on. That makes sense.
Yeah, and again, you don't want to be pathologically paranoid. Pathologically paranoid means that you don't stop at 100 and you keep pouring things after you've reached that 100 or close to 100, but yeah, you want to some degree think about how things can go wrong.
There's been a lot of studies recently around how most industries are converging towards monopolies or oligopolies. So I think the top 4 players across most industries, they took an aggregate number, but top 4 players now account for on average 30% of their market. That has grown from like 15% 10, 15 years ago. There seems to be a concentration generally, which on the flip side means there's a dying off, effectively an economies of scale dynamic that's playing out. Do you ever work through these ideas and apply it to industry maturity ideas to be able to actually assess whether one industry is attractive versus another, or what point of maturity it's at, and having this process kind of what point of maturity it's at?
Well, the way in which I apply it is that sometimes it happens that I have the discussion with the founder of a company, and the discussion is about like what's the risk that the industry where you're in is like something where either you make it big or you disappear. And then what actually are you trying to achieve and what it means to disappear? Because there are 2 ways in which you can disappear. There is the way in which you disappear in the sense that your company effectively goes bankrupt because it cannot compete. And there is the way in which you disappear in the sense that you still remain a perfectly middle-sized, small to middle-sized company. And we need to understand, because there are some founders which are very happy with it, and there are some founders which they're not. More than being very prescriptive about like there is only one way, it's really about asking yourself, what are the possible futures? What is your profile against those futures? So how likely are those futures, and are you happy with it or not? And once you have mapped out this, you can take some decisions which you would be doing blindfolded if you weren't thinking this way.
It's really interesting how dynamic a process it is, because it sounds very theoretical, but actually in practice it's not. It's embracing of the outcomes and then actually playing those realities out, but being honest with yourself about the potential and the probability generally.
Yeah, the thing is that just like there is a maximum reproducible speed and there is a maximum reproducible return, there is a maximum level to which you can go into practice and which you can look at data. And above, there is a level to which those things bring information, and above which they don't bring more information, they actually mislead you. Of course, you need to look at the past and learn from experience, but it cannot be the only thing that you do. And if all you do is to try to churn data and or go into very concrete things without thinking about things that you can only do abstractly, you're actually hitting negative returns.
One of the other ideas that this has stuck with me for a long time is this idea of irreversibility absorbing future gains. And I know that we've touched on it a little bit in terms of how we've spoken to the maximum reproducible return or strategy. But can you just, for the benefit of an audience member who may not be familiar with the context, can you just speak to irreversibility, that concept, and actually just where you're seeing it be maybe underappreciated in businesses generally?
Yeah, so the idea of irreversibility is that, well, let's say, for example, that you have an investment, 10,000 euros, and you lose 50% of that. You didn't just lose 5,000 euros, but you also lost all the future gains that those 5,000 euros could have produced. Plus the fact that maybe you also lost some clients, you also lost the trust of other people and all those things. So the thing is that in the real world, losses, when there is a component of irreversibility, you should like over calculate the impact of losses, which again doesn't mean zero risk tolerance. It means that you consider risks a little bit higher than you would because they have those effects. It's the idea that if an investment goes up 50% and goes down 40% afterwards, you're not up 10%, like some people naively will calculate, but you're actually down almost 10%. So does it mean that you shouldn't take at all those risks that lead to the 40% loss? No. It means that you should realize that those risks, which nominally in the short term look like 40% loss, they should actually be weighted closer to 60%. That's kind of the idea. And once you start seeing it, you see it in a lot of things that we underweigh situations and contexts and risks which have this irreversible component, or at least this harder to go back than it was before component.
If we could unpack those, like what are the main ones that you see within a business owner's context and within a day-to-day kind of to-do list? What are the major irreversible areas that they may be not thinking about through the lens you just described, but actually thinking about it as a more reversible outcome?
Well, a big one is trust, for sure. And trust, I mean both like trust that I should trust you, but also trust that when you say something, I should take you seriously. And this is a big one which I see managers failing with all the time. Like managers which say there is a deadline and then they don't work as if there was the deadline. They do not follow up. If we need to shift it 1 week in the future, it's no big deal, and so on. What's the result? The next time you say there is the deadline, I won't take you seriously. Or the manager who says, this task is very important, and then they do not check whether you did it and whether you did it correctly. Again, the lesson I will take is that I will not take your word seriously. And there is a level of irreversibility because it's something that takes one action to undo the trust, and then maybe it takes again months to rebuild it. And this is something that, again, you don't see it in the short term, and that's why you might be tempted to take different decisions, to change the deadline as if it were no big deal, and so on. But then they have a very big long-term consequences. And then, by the way, like the lesson is not once you say that there is a deadline, you should never move the deadline because there are good reasons to do it. But the thing is that every time you move the deadline, you take this very seriously, which means it's not a decision that you take in a blink of an eye. It means that you follow it with an incident investigation, even if it's informal, and with some action to make sure it doesn't happen again, and these other things. So being taken seriously is a very big thing. And then another thing is the engagement of your people. That's another resource which is very reversible. I remember when I was managing people myself, I was almost like feeling like in a video game where each of the people around me, they have a health bar over the head, like in video games, except it's an engagement bar. And the thing is that if I take some actions, they will decrease the engagement of my people, and it's extremely hard to rebuild that. And what decreases the engagement? For example, them doing something good and me not noticing. That teaches them that acting as an engaged employee is not worth the effort in this company. And this is a thing that once it happens once, very hard to rebuild. Yeah, so these are just some of the examples. And the same applies with customers, of course.
I was speaking with a researcher earlier today who said people don't leave jobs, they leave cultures. And it reminds me very much of what you're saying, where it's sort of once you've created or allowed a culture that people don't want to be part of, that's sort of one of those potentially very large risks that you don't really notice day to day, but if you get it wrong, huge irreversible loss.
Exactly. And to build on that, people don't leave a bad corporate culture. They leave a bad team culture, almost always. And this is very important because it means that the solution is not to change the company's culture, but it's to change the culture across all the teams, which requires very different thinking and action. Because when you think about I need to change the company's culture, a lot of people, they think like, oh, we can do it with like a new launch, some materials, new core values. And so. But if you think that what you need to change is the culture within each of the teams instead your company, then it needs a very different approach.
If we would try to bring those two concepts together, the 99% happiness concept and the concept of irreversibility, is there a hierarchy to that? So would you want to basically like exclude everything irreversible, and then within that, then you would apply the 99% rule? So with the 1% of like outcomes where you're not really happy with, you would still make sure that those are not irreversible.
Yeah, good question. I would actually do it the other way around. So the idea is I will take as much irreversibility as I can, of course, if it comes with a positive upside, up to the point in which I can keep being happy in at least 99% of the parallel worlds. That would be my idea. So I don't know, if you think about in terms of personal life, I don't know, I will do like extreme sports up to the point in which I don't have a cumulative chance of serious injury higher than 0.1%, for example. That would be my reasoning. And the same with investments. I will take risks and whatnot up to the point in which I am happy in at least 99.9% of parallel worlds.
I think that's a good summary. That ties a lot together that we've talked about. It's been wonderful to jam on this topic. I'm going to nudge us towards our two traditional closing questions. So the first is, say a little bit about where people can contact you. And obviously you have your new book out. And then say a little bit about what kind of help you're looking for.
Yeah, so my new book is called Winning Long-Term Games, which you can find on Amazon and on plenty of other stores. And you can find me on my website, which is luca-dellanna.com, spelled with double L and double N. So luca-dellanna.com, double L and double N. And I'm also very active on Twitter, not so much on LinkedIn. And how people can help me? So one thing is, if you like the book and you like those ideas, spread them. The other thing is, I really think that those concepts are super important. A lot of times people tell me like, Luca, but I get what you're saying, but we also need a lot of Elon Musks. And you're basically saying the opposite of what Elon Musk does. And my answer to that is, yes, we need a lot of Elon Musk. And the reason why we don't have enough is because the Elon Musks, they don't have a good risk management. And if more people read this book, I believe that we would have more Elon Musks, not less. And so that's why I believe that it's such an important thinking, and why I'm spreading it. And so, like, if you have any ways in which you can help me spread it, you want to invite me to speak somewhere, or you want me to bring those ideas operationally in your company, in your organization, let me know.
That's a wonderful way. It's just a great frame. We don't have enough Elon Musk because we don't know how to manage risk. That's a great way to put it. Well, our traditional final closing question is, what's your highest or best experience ever been with quality? But as a returning guest, you've answered that before. So instead, I'll ask, what's the best example or story that you've seen of a person or an organization playing long-term games, at the highest level?
Well, I have a great experience with my former company, which was playing very long-term games in the terms of core values and in the terms of safety. So safety was a core value of the company. And the thing is that a core value, like what makes it a core value is not just like that the CEO or someone from HR said, now it's a core value. But core values are always trade-offs. They're always a short-term cost and a long-term benefit. And the safety has a lot of short-term cost, meaning you will need to buy some more expensive equipment or you will need to do things a bit slowly, but they have a long-term benefit, which is we keep our talent able to work for us for longer, we have fewer incidents that stop our operations and so on. And so the way that you keep this cultural value alive is by repeatedly taking choices, taking these trade-offs on the long-term side and on explaining why you're doing it. So I have a good example on this. Once it happened that some people from my company were visiting a plant, and we took a bus. We were waiting for a bus at a hotel that would take us to the plant half an hour away. And the bus comes. My boss's boss is the first one to go in. He sees that there are no safety belts, and he tells the bus to go back to the depot and the company to send another bus, this time with belts. Very expensive decision because it wasted about 17 people's salary for more than half an hour. He explained that he took it, even though it's costly, because he believes that safety is just so important. And that was the thing that made us understand the value that they put to the long term. And so bringing forward the long term is all about taking those decisions and explaining them that you took them not because it's compliance, not because of an irrational belief, but because you're trying to optimize something. And you're aggressive and ambitious in how you're optimizing this. It just so happens to be in the long term. And I want to tie it up with a last thing. I happened to read a recent article by Byron Hobart where he was saying that strategy, for something to be strategic, it has to be something that not everyone believes in. And you as the CEO believe that it's more worth than other people believe, and that it's almost necessary for the long term. And so this is like long term is strategic in this way, in the sense that not everyone believes in it, you believe it's worth it, and it's actually a very strategic and ambitious decision that will bring long-term gains.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for being a returning guest. Congratulations on your new book, and I hope many people read it, many people enjoy it.
Yeah,
and thank you. Yep. Thank you so much for having me.
Speak soon.
Thank you for listening. And for more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you think of anyone that could be a good fit for this format, please reach out via the website.